This conference will now be recorded.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Cole Greaves. I'm one of the members of the CABAA Safety Committee, and today we'd like to welcome you guys into our last safety webinar of 2024, being presented by Nimbl. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat box, and we'll answer them in the Q&A later on in the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Cole. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Avoid Roadblocks, the latest on LOAs and International Operations. I'm Gary Webb, your moderator, and I'm excited to guide you through today's discussion. At Nimbl, we're the leading provider of manuals and safety management services. Our team of experts handle everything for you from manual development and regulatory updates to implementation of tools that make SMS a breeze, all paired with the best in customer service. We navigate manuals and safety management so you don't have to. We're joined by two experts. Clement Meersman, Senior Operations Advisor at Nimbl, who brings an extensive experience in aviation safety and regulatory processes. Also with us is Madison Smith, Senior Advisor at Nimbl, with deep expertise in LOA processes and international operations. Together, they'll cover the latest updates on LOAs, the ramp inspection program, and share strategies for navigating international operations and avoiding common pitfalls. Let's dive into the main topic today of today's webinar. To get started, I'll hand it over to Madison to begin with an overview of LOAs and their importance in the industry.
So what are LOAs? They're letters of authorization issued by the FAA to fly in specific airspace. For Part 91, they're required to basically fly anywhere outside of the continental US, and they make your life a lot easier because when they're issued by the FAA, they're not issued by every single individual place you're flying into. And they make your life a lot easier because they allow you to fly into airspace that is more desirable. It saves fuel or it saves time. That's why you want to fly in RVSM airspace or fly straight across the NAT-HLA into Europe instead of taking one of the blue spruce routes. A lot of states will determine the requirements for the LOAs that you need to fly to that country, and they'll publish them in places like AIP's state publications, or ICAO will let you know. We have a couple of different examples here on the screen. The one that I see most often referred to is the one that requires you to have RNP1 capability to fly into Hong Kong International Airport. It's airport specific. It's a little bit weird, but it clearly shows that these requirements aren't set by the FAA. They're set by the international bodies that you're flying into. And the FAA allows you to basically one-shot done your authorizations because you're going through them instead of trying to get them from Hong Kong to be able to show Hong Kong that you can fly there. I think that's it.
Now that we've had a brief overview of LOAs, let's look at the 10 main LOAs commonly requested. Clement, could you briefly explain these key LOAs and their functions?
Yeah, absolutely. Great to see everyone this morning. So there's about 10 or so LOAs that you really want to pay attention to when you're a Part 91 operator. I think most folks on the line here are Part 91, and those are listed on your screen here. I'm not going to go in detail on all of them, but you can see here some are linked to specific airspaces that require approval, so say the NAT-HLA or RVSM, and others are specifically linked to be able to use certain capabilities of your aircraft, like data link or EFES. It's important to note that each of these LOAs has their specificities as far as how you apply for them and what's required when you apply, and we'll go into a little bit more detail for that afterwards. But as Maddie mentioned, for example, CO63, which authorizes you for those RMP and RNAV terminal ops, the SIDS and STARS essentially, that's going to be something that's quite widespread across the world, whether it's in countries in Europe or Hong Kong, as she mentioned, or other areas. So it's really important to understand that these are not just a requirement for kicks. It's actually a requirement because the state actors require you to have those. And most of these LOAs are made available to operators by the FAA to meet international requirements. A couple more that I think are worth noting is the D195, D095. Both of those are on the screen here, as you can see. You can only operate with one or the other as a Part 91 operator. The usage of the D195 is preferred because that meets the requirements of a lot of international regulators. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the second part when we talk about SAFA inspections, because that's been a big topic. Um, but it's important to know that both are available for Part 91 operators, though, as I mentioned, it's preferable to get customized MEL, not just to meet the requirements of international regulators, but it's also because it's a much better document, easier document for you to use. Um, there's a couple more LOAs that are listed on here that you may not be as familiar with, and those are at the bottom, the C384, C81, and C59. Those are also LOAs that are available to Part 91 operators, though albeit they are not as common and don't restrict you as much in not having them as some of the other ones. And we'll talk a little bit more about why you would want to get these in a bit. But essentially, the philosophy that we have at Nimbl and that we recommend our clients do is to obtain all the LOAs that you have been trained for, that your aircraft's capable of, and that you have procedures for. Those are kind of the three pillars of all the LOAs, if you will. The reason why we recommend that is because you don't want to be caught all of a sudden doing a trip in a place that you had not previously thought you were going to be doing and be stuck not having the authorizations doing it. We've run into a lot of clients at Nimbl that mentioned to us they never fly over the NAT HLA. Boss never goes to Europe. And then all of a sudden, 6 weeks later, a Formula One race is going on in Monaco or something, and all of a sudden they decide they want to go to Europe, and you're left scrambling in 6 weeks to get an LOA, which I'm sure a lot of us know on the call is quite arduous given the turnaround times. So again, a good idea to make a mental note of all these LOAs. If your aircraft has the capabilities, definitely recommend that you obtain all of those, Gary.
Wonderful. So now that we've covered the 10 main LOAs, let's dive in how to identify which ones you need. What factors should guide your decision? Madison, could you walk us through how to determine the right LOAs?
Of course. So LOAs are a little bit like a puzzle. There's a bunch of moving parts, and once you have everything together, it sort of falls into place, but you should know exactly like how that works. So your LOAs are tied to both your operation and your aircraft, which means that if one changes, then so does the other. Um, that means that you need to know what your operation can do. So what your international procedures are, and that you have international procedures. You need to know what you've been trained on, both procedures wise, but also specific to the aircraft that you're applying for. And you need to know what your aircraft can do, which means that if you have one or two of those pieces, but you don't have the third, you cannot get the authorization. So say that you know your aircraft can do RNP2. You know that it has TCAS 7.1 and that you can fly into Europe if you want to. You've looked at your AFM and it's confirmed this. You know that you've done your international operations procedures training within the last 2 years. And then you apply and you realize that you don't have an international operations procedures manual. You can purchase one off the shelf and it works fine, but if you don't have it when you're applying, you can't apply. You need to have all three pillars in order to actually obtain these authorizations. So knowing which ones you need is more about knowing what training you have, what procedures you have, and what your aircraft has, and then figuring out what you can do. And once you know that, you should apply for everything you possibly can, like Clement said, because sometimes these authorizations can take a couple of months to actually obtain. Um, as another note, as you can see on the screen, we have a portion of an AFM pulled out for you. It says on the AFM that it does not constitute an operational procedure. That's because even though your aircraft can do it and the AFM says your aircraft can do it and you've been trained for it, unless the FAA says you can do it, you're still not allowed to do it, at least internationally.
So beyond knowing what LOAs you need, there are a few more items to consider. Clement, what are some key points operators should keep in mind during this process?
Yep, and that's a great question, Gary. I think it's important for everyone to know. And by the way, in parentheses, maybe some of you are going to look at these questions and feel like, well, those are kind of trivial. But the fact of the matter is, we operate in a very complex industry with operating names, crews, addresses, who's responsible for what, who's doing what, and it can sometimes get a little nebulous. So we thought it'd be important to kind of hit some of these points that we see often, that are often questions that come up. First of all, what's the name of the operator? For a lot of you, that may seem very self-evident, but we see it all the time. There's one aircraft, couple crews that are operated by multiple operators. Is the operator the owner of the airplane? Is it the lessee of the airplane? Who really is operating the aircraft? Well, I have a non-answer for you. Nothing's right, nothing's wrong. It really all depends on how your structure is put together, and we recommend that you talk to some legal counsel to figure that out, because there are implications on who the name of the operator is, because that is really what the FAA is basing these LOAs on. There is liability associated to this, so it's really important to get it right. That's why it's a good idea to talk to some legal representatives to understand exactly what name should go in there. Second of all, what FSDO should I use? I think a lot of you on the call probably have a great relationship with your FSDOs, but that can also get a little bit nebulous. Perhaps your company has multiple offices in multiple states. Maybe the aircraft is based in Florida, but the company's based in Santa Barbara. Who's really going to be responsible? What FSDO is going to be responsible for my application? Well, the answer is pretty much the FSDO you would like, and that may surprise a few of you on the call. The FAA came out with a memo early last year to actually clarify really how your address is tied to the FSDO that you're using. And the fact of the matter is, the FAA, as far as Part 91 is concerned, does not have the wherewithal to tell you which address you should be using for your operation. So that's fairly open. And you'll see at the end of the presentation, we do have our email addresses up there. If anyone's interested in seeing that memo, I'd be happy to share it. How do I know if I already have LOAs? In an industry that's ever changing as far as workforce goes, new people coming in, coming out. How do I know if my operation's already been approved for some of these things? So the easy way there is to contact your FSDO, and you can get a copy of the LOAs that you already have. Another question that comes up quite often is, should I be getting the LOAs, or should my management company be getting the LOAs? Again, that's all dependent on how you want to organize things. But if there's one recommendation we make, keep in mind that if the LOAs are under the name of your management company, and you decide for whatever reason that you would like to leave that management company, those LOAs are tied to the management company, meaning that all of a sudden you're out of LOAs essentially. So you would have to reapply. So we recommend for those folks who do operate Part 135 charter services to not only be on the certificate of the management company, but also have their own Part 91 LOAs. That's a really good insurance policy. Plus, it's actually the right thing to do. And then we have a few more points that I think should be addressed, Gary, is what are my obligations when these LOAs have been issued? Do they expire? So they don't. There is no expiration date on any of the current LOAs that we mentioned in the previous slide. There used to be prior, I think MNPS used to have an expiration date, or RVSM, I can't remember which. But today, there's no expiration date. Once you get them, you get them. But it's important to keep on following, and that's why it's important for folks to join webinars like this and to go to events, is to understand that some of these LOAs actually end up changing. So there are sometimes the necessity to get them reissued. A prime example I can give is in 2016, when the FAA announced they were going to rescind the MNPS LOAs because they wanted operators to reapply under the NAT-HLA terminology. That's a good example. And I think they gave them operators about 3 years to do that. So keep an eye on those things. As far as other administrative things, if you change your address, or let's say the person who has been designated as a responsible party changes, you'll want to notify the FAA. It's important because some of these elements appear on the LOAs that you've been issued, and you have about 30 days, I think, based on what the FAA mentions, to get that done. So that's an important thing to do. Again, these are typically administrative changes, so you're not required to reapply all over again, but it's important to let them know. What happens if your company changes name or registration? that's the same thing. You'll want to notify your FSDO that there's been a change so they can reissue those LOAs with the appropriate name change. And then what happens if I sell my airplane? Some of you on the call here have multiple aircraft. You're selling an aircraft. Some LOAs will list the airplanes you have, so it's important to make sure you clean that up with your FSDO as well. It's often an oversight because there's so much moving parts in selling an airplane, but remember to not leave that one out. And then finally, an important piece is, are my procedures up to date? And when we talk about procedures, we're talking about international procedures, which are a key point, as Maddie mentioned, one of the three pillars, so to speak, of all LOA applications. You want to make sure that those are always kept up to date. You can do it yourself or subscribe to a service like Nimbl offers, and make sure that those are always up to speed, because when you're going to apply for these LOAs, the FAA is going to look at your manual and ensure that you're keeping up to date, much like you're keeping up to date your training. That's definitely an important point. So I realize it's a lot of things, but there's a lot of little things that you want to keep in the back of your mind to ensure that you remain in compliance, Gary.
So now that we have those basics, let's take a look at the application process. Madison, can you explain the conventional LOA application process and what's required?
Of course. So the conventional application process, the one that probably more than a few of you guys have actually seen, is it's the most common one that we see over here as well. The FAA has published 4 official guides, but there are also a couple of LOAs where they haven't actually published guides for, but they've issued guidance that you can follow and create your own applications in order to apply for those authorizations. There's a couple of different components, and each component has its own requirements that can change from application to application. For example, for training, some of the authorizations require aircraft-specific training, which means that your pilots need to be trained on the specific aircraft model that you are applying for. So, for example, CPDLC, it used to only require procedural training. Now it also requires training on the specific CPDLC system installed in your aircraft. That changed a few years ago. We still see people who used to apply under the old training requirements coming to us and being surprised that now CPDLC requires additional training. And then there are some where it's procedural and you only need to really do one class in order to fulfill the requirements, even if you're applying for multiple aircraft and multiple models, like the International Operations Procedures training. You also need to have procedures. This is usually going to be an IOPM. It's usually going to be stock because the FAA does have specific requirements that need to be included in an IOPM in order to meet their standards. So you can get it stock and then you can have it edited to more apply to your specific operation. This is usually just going to be titles, but if you know for a fact that you're never applying for certain airspaces, you can tailor it down to just the airspace that you know you're flying into. You're going to have specific AFM excerpts, and you're going to have maintenance for any aircraft that was not manufactured with the capability that you are applying for. So let's say you have an aircraft that you know is not manufactured CPDLC capable, but you want to apply for CPDLC capability. When that happens, you need to have the AFM excerpt that explains like how the aircraft is CPDLC capable and what its specific CPDLC capabilities are, as well as the service bulletin or STC that brought it up to CPDLC capability, and the maintenance logs that show that you actually completed that maintenance. And when you do that, you should also have all those pieces clearly called out so the FAA inspector who is looking at your applications doesn't have to do any additional research. They should be able to look at a file, clearly see what it can do, how it was brought up to capability, and that you have done that required maintenance without Googling anything or looking at more than like 10 pages at a time. And that's just because that they usually have a very high volume of things to do. They don't want to also do research that they don't have to. There's a couple of additional things, like you're going to need a sample flight plan that meets the FAA's requirements. This is usually going to be an operational flight plan. And for example, the BO36 lists out exactly what those requirements are for the BO36 application. The AO56 does not. The VO36, the Oceanic and Remote Continental Operations Guide, was updated more recently. And so when they clarified that, those requirements carry over to the CPDLC, but it's not as clearly called out. So you're going to want to make sure that your flight plan is absolutely correct because they care about it a lot. Another additional things is like if you're applying for CPDLC, there's a FAN CRA website that you have to sign up for. It is not voluntary to sign up for some sort of service where you can voluntarily report issues with your CPDLC system. So you have to sign up for something where you can report, but it's voluntary to report when you have issues. The current one that we recommend everybody do is the FAN CRA website, where you sign up for the PBCS charter membership. And it's run by Air New Zealand. It's voluntary. Your name ends up on a website that shows that you're a stakeholder in the charter. And if you're ever confused, the person that runs the website is very nice, and he'll answer your questions if you email him. Yeah. Gary?
All right. So alongside the conventional process, there's also the LOA streamlined process, which can save a lot of time. Clement, can you tell us how the streamlined process differs?
Absolutely, Gary. This is a really exciting program, and maybe there's a few of you on the call that have heard of it that may have actually gone through it. So we had the great honor of being able to work on the committee that put this together. It was a multi-year effort with the manufacturers, the training providers, the FAA. Kind of industry and regulators came together and realized that there's better ways to and quicker ways to get LOAs issued. Enter the streamlined application process, or the SLOA, for the folks in the know. First of all, you just have to consider it as an easier, faster way to get your LOAs. Now, who's eligible for this? So when the program rolled out about 3 years ago, when we did the first sort of beta candidates, is originally only for Part 91 brand new factory delivered aircraft. And just seeing some names on the call here, I know some of you, we've worked with you on getting that done. So hopefully you've seen how successful it's been. But now over the past few months, we've shifted over to also include pre-owned aircraft, but that are still in production. So let me clarify that. Let's say you have a Falcon 900LX that's a couple of years old. Well, you can use the Streamline LOA program to get your LOAs. If you show up with a Falcon 20, you will not be able to do it, because the fact of the matter is Falcon does not manufacture the 20 anymore. So there are some options that make sure that this program is widened a little bit. The Streamline Application Program is based on sort of 3 pillars, the 3-legged stool, so to speak. It's the ASOC, the TSOC, the PSOC, and I'm gonna describe these individually here quickly. And you'll see it's very much the same concept as the conventional applications, just in a quicker fashion. So the ASOC is your aircraft statement of compliance. This is going to be given to you by your manufacturer. Okay, whether you're a brand new factory delivered or you're getting delivery of a pre-owned but in production aircraft, the manufacturer can establish an ASOC for you. Keep in mind the ASOC is serial specific, so it will mention the specific serial number of your aircraft. That ASOC is, depending on the manufacturer and the airplane, is 4 or 5 pages and literally outlines, it's a window sticker, if you will. It'll literally outline the airplane is compliant with all these LOAs and meets the requirements. Keep in mind that some of the ASOCs will also mention additional service bulletins or STCs depending on if there's options. Not all the brand new delivered aircraft come with all the capabilities standard. So if you've purchased certain options on the aircraft, say an EFVS system or CPDLC, the ASOC will mention it. So it'll still be important to include those additional documents when you apply. The second pillar is the TSOC. And I'm sure everyone knows what T is, training. And so that is going to be given to you by your training institution. Your Part 142 training school, your CAE or FSI, will issue a TSOC for your specific aircraft training, but they can also issue international procedures training, since they do provide those as well. And then the non-142 training institutions, like the 30 West IPs and Scott IPCs of the world, will also issue you a TSOC if you've done a course there. Much like the ASOC, the TSOC will say if Bob has done his G500 training at flight safety, then his course complies with all his LOAs. So it's a really comprehensive way for the FAA to see that that the courses that you've taken meet the requirements of the LOAs. And then finally, the PSOC is the procedure statement of compliance, and that will be given to you by your procedures provider, such as Nimbl, and it will outline that everything that is in the International Procedures Manual that you hold meets the requirements of the LOAs. So you can see the three pillars: aircraft, training, procedures. One thing I want to mention is all these SOCs are approved by the FAA, meaning that the providers have gone out in advance and vetted, sort of a vetting process, if you will, with the FAA. And the FAA says, yep, all these meet the requirements of what we need for the LOAs. So in the application process, you're going to be including those three and a couple additional supporting documents, like Madison mentioned. A sample flight plan is still required, your FAN CRA sign up, and there's some technicalities depending on if you already have LOAs and you're just adding an airplane or not. But it's a very easy, we call it the 10-in-1 application because it's one PDF application that you can select essentially the 10 LOAs that you want, and you just send that over to the FAA. Now, the major difference between the conventional and the streamline, aside from what we've already talked about here, is that it doesn't actually go to the next gen folks, the AFS 400 folks. The FSDO is, and your POI is the only person doing the review of this. And the reason for why we're doing this is because your POI, your FSDO, doesn't need to really dig in much into all the documentation that you're including, because the ASOC, TSOC, PSOC says everything's already good. So I don't want to call it rubber stamping. They're still doing their due diligence, but it's a much faster way because there's just a lot less work for your FSDO to do to issue these LOAs.
And what's interesting
As far
is
as,
that this
please.
streamlined process is sort of bleeding into the traditional process. When they reissued the BO36 application, they included options for applicants to have a PSOC or a TSOC included in the BO36 in order to make review of the specific items faster. So if you have a TSOC, they're not going to look as closely at your training provider's syllabus. And if you have a PSOC, they're not going to look as closely at your International Operations Procedures Manual's specific procedures because they've already been approved.
That's a great note to add, Maddie. There's a lot of these concepts of streamlining that are making their way through the FAA. So there's some exciting developments, and like Maddie mentioned, some of these statements of compliance can actually be used in the conventional application. So as far as submission times, obviously we're all concerned about how long it takes for the FAA to issue these LOAs. Well, the good news is with the streamline process, you can submit your application package up to 60 days prior to your aircraft being delivered. Now, the idea here is that by the time your airplane gets delivered, the LOAs have already been issued, and that gives abundant amount of time for the FAA to do so. You can also, depending on time, obviously there's a lot going on. The FAA has allows you to apply for these through the streamline with a plus 60 day, meaning 60 days after delivery. So there's a little bit of leeway here, but usually no one is surprised about getting a brand new aircraft. It's not like a last minute thing. So typically, it's encouraged to get this into your FSDO 60 days prior to delivery. As I mentioned earlier, there is a single application guide that is available. It's very comprehensive and enables you to apply for the 10 LOAs we talked about earlier within that guide. And then an exciting development, as you can see here, is that we've worked hard in the Streamline committee to include now D195 into the process. Some of you that have gone through the process have probably noticed that the only LOA you could get in there was the MMEL previously. Well, that's going to be shifting. You're going to be able to apply directly for the MEL, your customized MEL, within the Streamline program. So it'll really ensure that you get all your LOAs once your aircraft gets delivered, done, and you can focus on your operation afterwards. So those are some exciting developments that'll be published here sometime next year to look forward to. Again, up to you to see if you want to do this on your own or use a provider, but it is definitely a much easier, streamlined process than the conventional application carry.
So, whether applying through the conventional or streamlined process, it's important to know what the FAA looks for during this review. Madison, can you share what the FAA focuses on and some frequent challenges in this stage?
Course. So the very first thing is that when you have all this stuff ready to go and you go to submit it, your POI says, okay, I need you to submit it through OAPS. It's not every FSDO that does this, and it's not even every POI at every FSDO that does this. Um, but there are enough of them that I get some very interesting OAPS calls. Uh, Basically, what happens is the OAPS system is the FAA's proprietary system for uploading applications so that those applications can be transferred to WebOps where they actually like create the authorizations. And when that happens, your FSDO inspector needs to create for you your operation in OAPS, so you have an operations account. And then you and FAA IT are going to work together to get a OAPS account set up that's connected to the operations account in OAPS. It can take a couple of days. So if you know that you're going to be in a rush, I always recommend reaching out to your FSDO POI in advance of submitting so that you can get that done before you actually have to submit. And it makes things a little bit easier because it can take sometimes up to 2 weeks to get all of that set up in their system. The other way that you submit to your FSDO is through email. And the email system is also not the easiest because they have several security measures set up in order to protect their computers. One of them is that they limit the file sizes that they can accept, and the other one is that they limit like drive links, which means that if you have a huge file that you're sending to the FSDO and they click on it, they oftentimes cannot download it or it's going to bounce back to you. So you have to make sure that your submission file is small enough for them to accept, which can take sometimes spreading it across several different emails, and that the file itself is small enough that they can download it. So that's your FSDO is going to tell you when they can't download things, but you are going to have some knowledge of Word and also of Adobe in order to compress those files down to be small enough for them to actually be able to view them. After they've accepted that, you're also going to need to make sure that everything matches across all of your applications because you need to have the same pilots, the same tail number, the same operator name, and the same contact info across all of your applications. If one of them is different, they're not going to accept them, and you're going to have to edit everything and choose which of the two that you accidentally picked is actually the right one. Sometimes this comes from you had a tail change in the middle of creating your applications, and some of the applications have the old tail and some have the new tail. Some of it just comes from an odd email. Just an extra review right after you've received your applications or right before you're submitting them can cut down on at least some of that turn time. The other thing is that flight plans are still an issue. Part of this is because when you fly into Europe and you get ramp checked, the ramp inspectors are looking at your flight plan to make sure that everything is accurate. And the FAA wants to make sure that you're not going to get in trouble. Part of that is because the FAA wants to make sure that you know everything that needs to be included in a flight plan and that all of your coding is correct. I see it very often that I receive a flight plan from somebody with a pre-owned aircraft and they're using the same codes that the previous owner had used. And maybe the previous owner wasn't flying in the same airspaces or wasn't flying internationally or capability changed and they never updated their flight planner. So they're using old coding that doesn't actually work for the things that they're trying to get approvals for. So their flight plans won't include any R&P coding, won't include CPDLC coding. And so you want to make sure that when you're moving from one flight, when you're either adding your new aircraft to your flight planner or if you're using the aircraft's previous flight planner, that those codes are correct. Because the FAA does review every single one of them and they will make you fix it. NBAA has a good guide on how to format your flight plan, and then the FAA also has published a guide for specifically flight planning codes. So if you just give those a quick review before you submit everything, it'll save you some time. The next one is training. There's different requirements for different applications, and then some applications have changed the requirements over the years. I mentioned earlier that like CPDLC has a new requirement where you have to include uh, aircraft specific CPDLC training. I'm sorry. But also sometimes training is too old. And it doesn't say anywhere that there is a requirement that your international operations procedures training needs to be less than 24 months. But the FAA will not accept anything older than 24 months. And in fact, sometimes you're coming up on that date and you submit and your training's at like 20 months old, and it takes the FAA a little bit of time to review it. And then suddenly your training's at 23 months and they'll make you send them new training records. So just making sure that your training is up to date and as new as possible is going to help you save some time. And then there's other aircraft specific training. So you need to have aircraft specific EFVS training if you're applying for it, and you need to have aircraft specific approaches. And some offices, some FISO offices want to make sure that aircraft specific approach training is formatted to say that it has some specific items. For example, the um, the IFO out of Florida wants to make sure that your aircraft specific approach training has stars listed specifically, um, because that is a requirement and they catch it every single time. Another one that I see very often is like maintenance logs being unclear. You have to make sure that when you do your maintenance logs, your service bulletins, your STCs, and your AFM, they all match up. So if your service bulletin is not called out in your AFM, sometimes the FAA will go back and make you pull up another item that specifically shows that this service bulletin does in fact grant this capability to this model of aircraft. And that's because they want to make absolutely sure that the service bulletin that you have, especially if it comes from like my apologies, one second. My apologies. That they want to make sure that the maintenance logs that you have very clearly are for both the aircraft that you are applying for and that they actually grant the aircraft the capability that you are applying for. Sometimes this is because the name is different, so you know that the service bulletin is for this thing, but the service bulletin itself doesn't say that. So just making sure it's as clear as possible that if you gave this to a lay person who did not know your aircraft, they could still see that this was for this purpose is going to make everything easier with the FAA. And the last thing is that tabletops can happen. If you send in your applications and everything is wrong, the FAA does oftentimes follow a tabletop compliance matrix, which means that if enough things are wrong with your applications and you've resubmitted it wrong enough times, they can request a tabletop so they can sit down and review things with you. Sometimes this is because they want to make sure that their communication is clear, and sometimes it's because they want to make sure that when you are applying for these things, that you understand what you're applying for and why. And this is just one other way to make sure that everybody is doing things correctly. Gary?
If I can add just a quick note, and maybe some of you on the call have maybe started seeing this, but it's applying for LOAs. It's also a fantastic way, and I know it may not seem like it because for a lot it's not an enjoyable process, but it could also be a fantastic way to actually audit your operation in a way. Make sure that my flight planning codes are good. Make sure that my flight packages are good. Maybe that my training is up to date, that my international procedures are up to date. So, and that's how the FAA kind of treats it as well. It's sort of an audit on your operation for these types of operations that you're applying for. And keep in mind, here in the States, as a Part 91 operator, the FAA doesn't often have the occasion to audit an operator. So this is really the medium that they use. And Maddie mentioned the FAA tabletop compliance matrix, which is kind of like a risk assessment if you look at it. When the FAA and specifically NextGen uses this, they'll say, have the operator been approved for this type of aircraft before? So let's say if you're going from a PC-12 to a G700, the FAA may look to do a compliance matrix. So they'll add specific scores for specific items, and if you go over a specific score, that'll trigger a tabletop. So doesn't happen super often, but just know that it does exist. Gary.
Thanks, Lamont. So let's now focus on the ramp inspection program, which ensures compliance with international safety standards. We'll cover the details, key statistics, and how to prepare for these inspections. With that overview in mind, let's dive into some key details of the ramp inspection program and understand how it works. Clement, could you start by sharing some more specifics about these inspections?
Absolutely. And I can see some of your faces. If I say SAFA, I'm pretty sure no one's going to put their hands up in the air and sound all excited. It's something obviously that we all have to live and deal with. It is a advancement in safety, at least that's how it's considered by all the member states. And notice I'm saying member states, not the Europeans, because you can see the map here on the screen. It's growing. A lot more states around the world are becoming members of SAFA, which, by the way, stands for Safety Assessment of Foreign Aircraft. You'll see on the map here Canada, Brazil, Australia, the UAE, Morocco, essentially all these states that are outside of Europe have joined SAFA. So we haven't heard of inspections going on much in Canada or Brazil, but just know that they are members and you can be ramp inspected to the SAFA standards. Keep in mind, we talk a lot about SAFA, but there's many other organizations that are in these countries around the world. So you can still get ramp checked, but just maybe not by SAFA. So keep in mind that a ramp inspection can occur in a lot of places, not just SAFA countries. You'll have the list here, just so you know here on the slide. What can you expect during a ramp inspection? I know a lot of you have undergone that, and typically for the operators that are coming out of the States with some new aircraft and whatnot, the inspectors will usually run through a few questions, kind of gauge the operator, and depending on the answer you're given and how well you're organized, that's usually where the inspection stops. But do know that it can go further if those answers are not to the satisfaction of the inspector. And yes, I mentioned the satisfaction of the inspector. It's like everywhere, individuals have their own ways of seeing things. So keep that in mind. We do mention here on the slide SACA, which I'm sure most of you have never heard of, but SACA is essentially the equivalent of SAFA, except it's for community aircraft, meaning aircraft registered within the European community. So you'll never get a SACA inspection unless you're, say, registered in France or Belgium. The great news about all this, and we're going to talk about it in a little bit here, is that you can actually prepare for this stuff. So it's not a pop quiz. You don't have to make stuff up on the fly. And again, it's a great opportunity for operators to really dive into the organization of their operation and make sure they're kind of tip top. And to do that, EASA does provide a detailed ramp inspection checklist that will list all the items that an inspector can ask you about. And they're far and few between. It could be the MEL, could be the status of the exterior condition of the aircraft, interior condition of the aircraft, how you're stowing cargo. There's quite a lot of things they can look at, but it is outlined in that ramp inspection checklist, which is publicly available through the EASA website. As I'm sure you've heard, there are findings. So what is a finding? It is when the SAFA inspector finds something that is wrong during their inspection. Those can be say, and we'll look at that a little bit, but something maybe related to your MEL. But there's three categories: 1, 2, and 3, and then 3 is then broken down further. A category 1 finding is essentially just a notification to the operator that they're non-compliant with a certain aspect of the ramp inspection checklist. A category 2 triggers a report, and that report actually gets sent to an office here in the States for those FAA registries. That is AFS 50. It's sort of the international office for the FAA, and the FAA does get a copy of the report indicating that SAFA has found something wrong during an inspection. And then a category 3 is the one that we're all very worried about, is one that could potentially ground the airplane, meaning the inspector finds something, they deem it as a category 3, and again, it's not made up, it's all outlined in the checklist, and they can say, until you guys fix this, the airplane's not moving. So that's why it's really important to have your operation well put together and be prepared for this, so you're not kind of left as a deer in the headlights, Gary.
Now, let's look at the numbers behind ramp inspections, understand their scope and frequency. Madison, can you share some key statistics here?
Of course. So we pulled the SAF inspection numbers from 2019 because 2020 was very low in terms of flights. So the numbers were really skewed. And as you can see, general aviation is only 6% of the total SAF inspections actually performed. Um, there were a pretty low number of findings. Um, and of those, category 2 were the most common. Um, and I think that's just because, as you'll see on the next slide, some of the stuff that counts as a category 2 in a SAF inspection is not necessarily required by US operators by the FAA. Now, this is specific for the MEL. Europe does not like, and SAFA does not like, the use of an MMEL as an MEL. So when you see the next slide and you see that, that's probably why some of those numbers are the way they are. But as you can see, category 1, category 3, roughly equal. And that is, I think, pretty normal. One of the main areas of concern for general aviation tend to just be, is your aircraft maintained correctly? So are there defects? Are notifications of those defects clear? Is the general internal condition, the safety instructions, and your doors and hatches in good condition? Is your security of cargo on board, does it meet standards? These are all very safety focused. The SAFA is not there to catch you up or to make you meet weird standards that you wouldn't normally hold yourself to as a safe operation. It's there to make sure that when you are flying into countries as a foreign operator, that you are being safe. So they haven't recently released inspection numbers from 2021 to 2024, so I'm not sure when we're getting that next SAFA inspection report.
Yeah, if I can add, it'll definitely be interesting to see when the new report comes out. Most likely sometime early next year. But as you can see, and maybe I'd like to point to that second bullet point here. Obviously, all of these are quite important, but the second one kind of goes back to those LOA applications we were talking about, right? The sample flight plan and making sure that your flight is well prepared. Do you have the proper fuel allocation? Do you have NOTAMs? Do you have your rain report? Do you have all your weather? Is your mass and balance calculation accurate? Or weight and balance, as we call it. So all those things that when you applied for the LOA, you went through, which seemed to be a bit of a pain to rectify, that actually pays dividends down the road because there's other folks also looking at that. And on top of it, it just makes you a better operator.
So next, let's examine an example, the minimum equipment list and its role during the inspections. Madison, can you explain
Hi.
how the MEL comes into play?
Good. Oh, I can see what I. Oh no. I'll help you. I want to go.
I think
I
somebody
think we have,
might need.
there we go.
There's a baby on board.
That's the
So
sound you hear when you don't prepare for a SAF inspection. Oh no.
um, so looking at the screen, you can clearly see that a category 2 finding is MEL not available, no deferred defects. But a category 3 finding is MEL not available with deferred defects. Um, while they are concerned if you don't have an MEL, that's not going to generate a severe finding. It's when you've done something that is also unsafe, like deferring things when you're not necessarily allowed to defer them, that triggers that category 3 finding. Um, there's category 2 is also MMEL instead of MEL. As I was talking about on the previous page, that might be one of those reasons that the category 2 is higher than category 1 or category 3 findings in the 2020 report. Is a lot of US operators have been using the D095 and haven't switched over to the D195 because it's not technically required. But if you are ramp checked, you're going to get a category 2 finding that's then reported to AFS 50, where because the FAA allows it, doesn't really generate anything beyond that in terms of like coming back onto the operator.
Just if I can add, Maddie, this is an excerpt from that checklist I mentioned earlier. So you can clearly see what the inspectors are looking for. They're outlined by inspection item. You can see MEL is A07 in that checklist. And you can see exactly what an inspector is going to be looking for. And you can see some of these are quite important, you know. Let's say you're not using a customized MEL and you have to defer an item, something potentially major, that's a category 3 finding. That could potentially ground your airplane. So that's why it's really important to be in tune with what's in this checklist so you can adequately prepare and make sure you have everything in place before you fly to a SAFA member state or any state, really. I think this is again, a really good way to make your operation just better and safer overall, not just complying with standards and regulations.
So now that we've seen an example, let's talk about how to prepare for a ramp inspection. Clement, what can operators do to be ready?
Yeah, so I think we talked a little bit about this already, Gary. First of all, it's know what to expect. The worst thing as a pilot or as anyone really in our industry is to not know what's going on or what I can expect, right? Our main mission all the time is to have as much information as possible and prepare for all kinds of scenarios. So familiarize yourself with the process. And that's how that checklist I showed you can help you do that. The other thing you can do to really be tip top on your game is to make a SAFA binder. And you can either do that on your own or you can work with a provider such as Nimbl to help you do that. And what you can do is essentially take each of these items on the checklist and kind of just get ready to answer them. So make sure to, say for the MEL, make sure you have your MEL readily available. Make sure that it's customized, that to your aircraft. These items in the checklist will call the location of certain things. You have a fire extinguisher. Are your flashlights in good working order? So just kind of, it's really a sort of an auditing process, and kind of answer those questions as you go. Put that all in a binder, and that way, when you do get asked those questions, you can quickly refer to that binder and answer those questions. The other thing that a binder really helps you to do is that when an inspector comes to your aircraft, it also shows that you've thought about this and that you're organized and that you're not just showing up without any knowledge of what's going to be happening. So it enables you really to get yourself much more prepared. A really good idea. Really recommend it. And then finally, I know again this sounds a little trivial and anecdotal, but talk to others. And I think if you're all here today, it's because you're interested in this and interested in getting more knowledge. But attending webinars like this, the NBA IOC is a great venue as well. Speak to other operators that have gone under inspections. And there's a lot. There's more and more. How did they go for you? There's certain countries that have slight differences in just the way they approach it. France, Spain, Germany will have differences. So it's good to talk to other operators. Finally, what I've noticed and what we've noticed is that AFS 50 and EASA have made themselves a lot more available in the past couple of years to talk to operators. And you'll see folks from the FAA and folks from EASA attend a lot more conferences, usually even have a table that you can come up to and talk and kind of better understand what the process is, answer questions. They make themselves a lot more available, we've noticed in the past few years. So really take advantage of that. and really get your game together so that when you do show up and there is an inspection, you're ready to kill it.
Wonderful. So before we open the floor for questions, I'd just like to thank our speakers for their valuable insights today. I'm sure everyone now has a clear understanding of how to navigate LOAs and ramp inspections more effectively. So let me pull up. It looks like we've received some pretty great questions here. To start off for the first one, are there any changes that are going to adjust the number of LOAs that have to be obtained, such as RVSM in the US domestic as an example? Clement, would you like to start that one out?
Yeah, sure, I'll take that one. Fantastic question. Because I think that question points to the fact that none of this is static. Nothing we do is static. Nothing is set in stone. You don't do it once and be done with it. So it's really important to keep in tune with this. What we've noticed over the past few years is actually a tendency of some LOAs actually going away. I don't know if some of you remember A153, ADSB out operations. I'm sure some of you on the call got that LOA. Well, that LOA no longer exists. BO34, PRNAV, BRNAV, which was a requirement for Part 91 operators to get. That was decommissioned as well. So the FAA is kind of looking at ways to render their processes more efficient for the operators. So yes, we are seeing LOAs go away. But on the flip side, we are also seeing new LOAs pop up, like CO59, SA-CAT1 operations, or EFVS, which really wasn't much of a thing 5-6 years ago. So hard question to answer as far as what's going to show up. There's new changes that are constantly evolving. I know the FAA is working on a new iteration of AC 9170 Delta, which is the oceanic and remote continental losing my train of thought. Advisory circular, and so you want to stay in tune with that to see if there's any new LOAs that may pop up.
Great, thank you. So the next question here, what sources of information would you recommend for keeping up with international operation changes, particularly in North Atlantic airspace? Maddie, would you like to answer that one?
Well, there's always the FAA's advisory circulars, but there's also, if you know that you have a group that is handling your operations procedures manuals for you, those vendors are always going to be able to answer any questions you have. So calling them up when you have one is a great idea. I've heard good things about ops groups as well. In general, oh, and NBAA will oftentimes produce articles about changes that are happening. So if you already have a group that you work with for compliance questions, always go to them first because that's why you work with them. But otherwise, the FAA is a good source, and then your local business aviation group will also usually have resources.
Great, thank you. And it looks like we might be getting close to our last question. This might be a little open-ended, very based on area and experience. But Clement, how long does it usually take to apply for an LOA and receive it? Is there anything an operator can do to speed up the process?
Yeah, so great, fantastic question again, one that comes up very often. What can you do to speed up the process? First of all, is to really try to get it right when you submit so that there isn't a back and forth that may delay. So really ensure all these documents that we talked about are nice and clear. Second of all, if you're depending on the type of application you're going to be doing, whether you're conventional or streamline, the streamline application, I think there's been close to 800 or 850 streamline applications that have been filed since the program came out. Overwhelmingly, and when I say overwhelmingly, we're probably in the 98, 99% range. Those LOAs have been issued by the time the airplane gets delivered. So that's a clear indication that that's a good way to go if you're getting a new airplane. But as with everything, the earlier you can get to applying for your LOAs, the better it's going to be. Because the fact of the matter is, maybe your FSDO has room to take care of these applications for you. But the other fact of the matter is that AFS 400, the next gen folks, there's only a handful of those that can process your BO40, your BO36, and AO56s. So on average, I'd say about 6 to 8 weeks if you're working with a pre-owned aircraft and going through the conventional way between the moment you submit and the moment you receive approval. So And if I may, Gary, actually, I'm going to go ahead and jump on these two questions because they're kind of related. I saw they came up
Yeah.
in the chat, both Rob and Scott. Great questions, by the way. Fantastic. I like where your brains are going. First of all, 550. You're correct. The 550 was still in production when the Streamline LOA came out, but Gulfstream decided that they were not going to produce a G550 ASOC. Now, that's not the end of the story. As I mentioned earlier, the manufacturers have now gotten into producing the pre-owned ASOCs. Some are inclined to maybe, and I'm giving you this sort of as some insider information based on the talks that are going on, but some of the manufacturers may be inclined to produce an ASOC for you for a non-in-production aircraft. The only way to know if they can do that for you is by contacting them directly. So definitely something to look into with that specific manufacturer. I cannot speak to what Gulfstream is doing on that end, but I would definitely ask them. And then another fantastic question related to the Streamline from Scott here. How long is the TSOC good for? So the TSOC typically is good for 24 months. And keep in mind, the TSOC is issued by the provider. So it's not something that's linked to you. It really strictly outlines that the course you've taken is compliant. So it's valid 24 months. It'll actually mention it on the TSOC itself. If you look at it, there is a note. There may actually be an expiration date that mentions it is valid 24 months. So you can look at that. If for whatever reason you hold provider gave you a TSOC and it's no longer good, you can just get a new one, their updated one directly from them. I did want to mention something very quickly about training. If some of the courses that are listed in the TSOC are date specific, so meaning if you've taken, say, an international procedures course, they may mention on the TSOC that that course would have to have been taken after a certain date because prior to that date, it may not be compliant. So definitely something to look at. And then to your second point, Scott, um, depending on if you already hold LOAs and you're adding another brand new airplane, you may not have to resubmit training documents for certain LOAs because the FAA has deemed that since you already hold LOAs, you don't need to produce any additional evidence. The only one that I know here specifically that always will require training records, regardless of whether you're creating a brand new operation or you're adding an aircraft, is CPDLC. So that will always have to be included, but most of the CPDLC courses now are included in your initials. So it's not like it's an additional course to take. So fantastic questions. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you to everyone for your great questions and participation today. Please feel free to reach out to anyone on the team here you see. If we don't know the answer, we will find the right expert in our team to connect you. Also, please don't hesitate to check out our free LOA guide. It's also on our website if you're unable to scan here. Any one of the questions that you submitted, if we haven't gotten back to you, we'll be following up with you after this. And Cole, I'll give it to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much to Gary, Clement, and Madison for this awesome presentation and everyone from Nimbl today. On the CABAA side here, we do have a couple events coming up here into the new year. Starting off in January, on January 14th, we have CABAA welcomes NBAA President Ed Bolin. There's a location that's still to be determined, but that'll be from 2 to 4 p.m. again on January 14th. Also coming up, CABAA's Safety Committee has another webinar coming up into the early months of 2025. And we also have our CABAA Safety Day, which is coming up in sometime in April of 2025 as well. So lots of good things to come up here, and I hope everyone from the CABAA Safety Committee to you guys, I hope everyone has a safe and happy holidays, and we'll see you guys soon. Thank you very much for tuning in today.
Thank you.